Hi, this is Tiffany Coral, and this is my EDL 854 Module 12 case study on the budget debacle. Section 1 is the case summary. This is taking place at Briardale Elementary. It is one of 6 elementary schools, and it serves around 600 students, grades K through 5. It also is part of the elementary is the large community event center as well for the district. The school focuses on a basic skills curriculum. This is allocated down from the superintendent. The budget for the teachers in the district to use is for that curriculum only. The school's foundation funds the supplemental curriculum, which is your arts, your musics, your foreign languages, and so forth. Part of the supplemental curriculum, the superintendent has formed sort of a competition amongst the elementary schools to raise the most funds for their supplemental curriculum. Part of the foundation at Briardale Elementary, there is a parent representative. In this scenario, it is Mr. Barley. He serves as the foundation president. He gives ideas for school improvement and curriculum suggestions to the site curriculum committee, which is a group of teachers, and then they ultimately select what they will use the money for. Mr. Barley, he is a Harvard grad. He is new to the community, and he is motivated to raise the most funds, more so because he is competing against a former classmate of his who also went to Harvard. And ultimately, Mr. Barley, he proposes a plan for a ticket raffle, and that will continue. Like I said, Mr. Morley, he is the foundation president at another elementary school, and that is kind of why Mr. Barley is competing so highly, I believe, is because he beat him out for class president at Harvard. It could be one of the many reasons. Mr. Santos, who in this situation is supposed to be myself. He is the elementary school principal. He is responsible for budgeting of the supplemental curriculum. So once the funds are raised by the foundation, then the principal is given that money to allot it the way that they have approved and decided upon. He was to create an orientation or inform Mr. Barley of his responsibilities as the foundation president as well. The school site curriculum committee I mentioned prior, so that is Mr. Santos' job to give them recommendations for school improvement and curriculum suggestions, and then they ultimately approve the recommendation. Mr. Santos did bring the ticket raffle to them, and they did approve that as a fundraiser. Ultimately, the ticket raffle fundraiser, it was for cash prizes. Mr. Barley came up with the idea because he had success with that at Harvard previously, and they raised over $100,000. So he saw this as a great success story that the school would raise a lot of funds for that supplemental curriculum. Section 1 continued of my case study. So the night of the fundraising event, it was held at the Briardale Community Center. All of the raffle tickets were sold that we know of. It was to be a historical fundraiser, one of the best and most successful in the school's history. The police received an anonymous tip, and they arrived at the start of the event and took Mr. Barley into custody. He was later released, but he was convicted of a misdemeanor, and he was placed on probation for an undisclosed amount of time. This event, it did make front page of the local newspaper, so it is putting a permanent mark on the Briardale Elementary, and it's definitely leaving some sort of stamp of a reputation, you could say. And then also Mr. Santos, the principal, because he was supposed to be overseeing and was in charge of giving Mr. Barley that orientation, he did become personally embarrassed by the results of this and his part in the proceedings. Section 2 is on the reporting. So there are legal and ethical issues that were presented in this case. So ultimately, a qualified nonprofit organization, government entities, and state regulated organizations, they can organize small game of chance. That is what the ticket raffle was a small game of chance. It was a cash raffle. But to partake in this, the organization, it has to obtain a proper license. My guess is in this case that that license was not obtained. The district, Mr. Barely, if he was arrested for this reason, then they did not apply and receive approval for that ticket raffle. It is not known at this time if there is a school board policy on ticket raffles or fundraising and what the proper procedures are. That is just not known. Or if Mr. Santos went over those regulations during the orientation. Some ethical issues that were present in this scenario is that the superintendent, the only supports he has are for the basic skills. So basically, where are all the available funds going? Are they being used negligently? Or is the supplemental curriculum, is that just not in the budget? Mr. Santos, he was in charge of informing Mr. Barley of the proper protocol and guidelines. Ultimately, why was it approved by the committee and the school district if the proper procedures weren't put in place? So that leads me to believe that there was no district policy on this. So the stakeholders that were involved and harmed by the events of the ticket raffle. Mr. Santos, he was embarrassed because he was partially the reason that this took place. He is somewhat responsible. Mr. Barley, he now has a criminal record. His reputation is flawed, and he has probation now for an undisclosed amount of time. Briardale School District as a whole, now it has bad publicity. It headlined the local newspaper, so they can face backlash from the community as well as the foundation to receive any additional funding for that supplemental curriculum. The Briardale students now, they have faced the possibility of not receiving that supplemental curriculum if the funds are not raised, as well as the foundation committee and other community members, they could lack future involvement, and they have a lot of questions that could arise about the values and missions of the school district as a whole. Section 3 is to synthesize. Briardale Foundation attempted to fundraise using ticket raffle sales to support supplemental curriculum, but instead the president faced criminal charges due to failing to obtain proper license. Section 4 is to synthesize the facts. So all the people involved, Mr. Santos, the principal, Mr. Barley, he was the foundation president. Mr. Morley, he was the competition, the foundation's committee as a whole, the superintendent who only backs the essential basic curriculum, the Briardale community who were probably the ticket holders, and the Briardale student body as a whole. Places involved, the majority of these actions, they have taken place at Briardale Elementary and the community center. But it's important to note here that we don't know all the locations of where the tickets were sold, as well as the police station is where Mr. Barley was booked and received his misdemeanor and his probation. Programs, so the school is believed to be a public school. It instructs students grades 5 through 8, or K through 5. Population is around 600, is one of 6 elementary schools in the district. It only focuses on the basic skills curriculum as far as the budget goes. And then after elementary school, there are 2 larger size middle schools and 1 large high school. At Briardale Elementary, there is a limited financial budget that we do believe, or the budget that they are given is not used in a proper manner. Section 5 is to review and prioritize. So this is a damaging situation, not only for credibility of the stakeholders, but also for their reputation. So the overall school district's reputation and credibility, Mr. Santos as a principal, and Mr. Barley as future jobs or volunteer work is concerned. Some other relevant stakeholders, the students could be damaged by this if they don't receive the proper funds for their supplemental curriculum. And the outcome of this affects the school district, Mr. Barley, Mr. Santos as the principal and his position, current and future students if those funds are not received for that extra curriculum, and then the families of those students as well as the current school board. Some unanswered questions from this case study. So did Mr. Santos's orientation, what was it like? Did it consist of the proper protocol and guidelines for him to be following and he just did not abide by them, or were they not there at all? Does the Briarden Elementary, do they even have a policy on fundraising and game of chance licensing? So if Mr. Barley was not, if he did not know about these, I mean, ultimately, I do believe he should have, because he had previous experience with this at Harvard and he kind of just ignored it, is my guess. What was Mr. Barley's misdemeanor for? Was it for not having that game of chance license, or was it for something that was completely unrelated? We do not know. Where is all the school's budget going? So are there appropriate checks and balances? Most schools do have a significant budget for the electives or the arts and musics. So for them not to have any budget for that is questionable. And why is there a competition amongst school? Is that really the best interest of the students and their learning and growth? Is that supplemental curriculum, is it going to be cut off if they don't receive those funds? I'd say more than likely. And lastly, was Mr. Morley that anonymous tip given to the police? So section 6 is the available option. So action 1 would be not to take any action at this time. So you're going to be receiving lots of questions from student families, the community, the school board, and the foundation, and possibly more bad publicity through media coverage. Action 2, you could try to go as the principal, Mr. Santos, and defend Mr. Barley's actions in court, try to get that misdemeanor and probation revoked. You could speak on his behalf and speak to press and take some of the blame as the principal or even as the school district if there was not proper protocol in place. With this, you're still going to face bad publicity, and there's no guarantee that that misdemeanor or that probation is going to be revoked. And really, the principal, he could see himself in more trouble based on that choice. Action 3, relieve Mr. Barley from his position, make a statement to the press, and then to send a district letter home to families explaining the situation. Some families could still be upset based on this response, and Mr. Barley, he could technically speak out on his own behalf, saying that it was the district's fault. Action 4, again, would be to relieve Mr. Barley of his position, make a statement to the press, and then begin updating or creating a policy that was not in place for fundraising, and to send a letter of apologies to all stakeholders and families. So this would involve board approval for that policy update or change. It ultimately does promote the positive well-being of the stakeholders and beginning to repair that relationship. And lastly, action 5 would be to, again, relieve Mr. Barley of his position, make a statement to the press, begin updating or creating that board policy, sending that apology letter, and then also planning a replacement fundraiser to make sure the students still receive their funds for the supplementary curriculum. So this promotes a positive well-being for the stakeholders and students. It begins that repair of the relationship, and it also involves board meetings and approvals. So section 7 is to basically evaluate these choices. So option 1 was no action. So this would be the easiest at this moment, but in the long run, it can lead to negative reputation for the school, and even disciplinary action for the principal if it's not handled correctly. Option two is the liberal action.